this is the question. He gets elected in 1964. According to the rules, he can run in 1968. And he was absolutely planning on running in 1968. And yet, by January of 1968, he pulls out.
What?
Because the country's mood totally changed between 64 and 68. They absolutely love him, and here they begin to hate him. Why? Crime goes through the roof. Why? How do we see crime? We see crime in race riots. We see crime in actual, just like property crimes. We see crime in a spike of violent crimes. Lawmakers in Washington, D.C. are getting mugged between their house and the Capitol. The crime rates are spiking. Then who do they blame for this? They blame Johnson. Because prior to 64, the crime rates were low. Suddenly, they're spiking out of control. Part of it is that he is dumping money into community action programs, into the cities. And rather than making the cities more calm, you're actually beginning to make them a little bit more violent. People get very upset about this. So when Nixon comes in, Nixon campaigns on a platform of law and order. Now, your textbooks will frequently say, the reason why JFK pulled out was because of Vietnam. Why is that a bad answer? You guys don't know, I'll tell you. We get into Vietnam, and it is LBJ that really pushes this in 65, but keep in mind, Kennedy began this in 63, 62. He sent advisors over. Eisenhower had nothing to do with Vietnam, and in fact recommended, when he came into office, he sent a letter to to Kennedy, I don't think we should get involved. But remember, Eisenhower is a general, and he's fairly conservative. He doesn't want to take risks. Well, JFK is young. He's big on taking risks. And so he wants to make a change. In foreign policies, he's a conservative. He's different from a lot of the other folks. So he wanted to be more aggressive. We'll talk about how this fits in with the Cuban Missile Crisis in a second, but it absolutely fits in there. The point is that in 65, that's when we get into Vietnam. By 68, we've got 600,000 people there. This is hard for you to imagine. But up until, say, 69, the public was very supportive of American involvement in Vietnam. We don't begin to see this change until 69. And largely, it was the media. They had a very famous Tet Offensive. And Walter Cronkite, who was a very famous anchor, got on and said, disaster in Vietnam. So he's telling the story about what's happened to the Tet Offensive. All the Vietnamese rose up and were pushing up against the United States. Disaster. Unfortunately, historically, the truth is exactly the opposite. The Viet Cong all died in the Tet Offensive. They were defeated. They rose up in a last-ditch effort, and the Americans totally defeated them. This was a turning point in the war, but it was a very positive turning point. But that's not the way it was reported. And so by this time, by 1969, that's when people start really changing their tune on Vietnam. LBJ decides to get out in 68, January of 68. This is before the Tet Offensive. It's not about Vietnam. You read his documents, you read his internal memories, it's all about crime. And when you look at Nixon, Nixon's campaign was all about law and order. Now, he does get us out of Vietnam. By 1971, he starts removing troops. By 1973, we're gone. We'll talk about this when we do Vietnam and Korea. You need to understand this in terms of the Cold War. But when does Vietnam get defeated by North Vietnam? 75. Who's not there? The United States is already gone. It's been gone for 2 years. Now, this is one of these really weird things in American history. Once we have this 1960 debate, once we have television becoming everywhere, our perception of events is not always determined by actual events. Often is determined by the perception of these events, one side or the other. You see riots everywhere, the perception is that crime is going out of control. Well, statistics seem to back that up. When you see the guy telling you that we're having a tough time in Vietnam, the general view is that we're losing Vietnam. Today, if I were to ask you, did we win Vietnam? What would your answer be? No. Do you know how many battles we lost in Vietnam? None. We didn't lose any battles. This is even going to shock you more. Who mostly fought in the Vietnam War? The Americans versus South Vietnamese, or South Vietnamese versus North Vietnamese, or the Americans versus North Vietnamese? We're talking 80% of the fighting was done by these guys. That's most of the fighting. 80%. It's not what you get. And it has to do with perception. Now, I'll tell you, part of the reason why we have this perception is that Nixon is responsible for getting us out of Vietnam. We're gone by 73. By 75, South Vietnam is taken over by North Vietnam. They're using Chinese officers and Soviet weapons. It's just a launched full invasion. Americans aren't there. What had happened in 74, just before that? You guys don't know. Nixon steps down as a result of Watergate. Is this fairly traumatic for our country? Have we ever had a president step down before? We've had presidents die. Have we had a president voluntarily step down? No. You get two major events, one after another. Who was mostly linked? It's very funny. Who's mostly linked with Vietnam? LBJ or Nixon? I had a student, this is about 15 years ago, I think I told you guys this. No. He told me that Richard Nixon should have been tried on war crimes for what he did in Vietnam. I had to laugh. Right? What did he do in Vietnam? He got us out of Vietnam. In fact, his Secretary of State got a Nobel Peace Prize for getting us out of Vietnam. Who was our Secretary of State? You guys know? Henry Kissinger, very famous guy. He gets a Nobel Peace Prize for getting us out. Who got us into Vietnam? LBJ. But that's not who we think of. If I were to ask you who got us in Vietnam, the urban legends in our brains is Nixon. He's responsible. And this kid is a perfect example of it. The truth of the matter is we're out. And we weren't defeated by the North Vietnamese. We weren't there. And yet, that common association is so strong. Nixon steps down, big disaster. Nixon's got a big black stain on his administration. And
was it because of Vietnam or Watergate?
Well, Vietnam is defeated at the same time, and so you put the two together, and then that's what you get. Perception is really a big deal here. It doesn't happen to fit reality. It's okay. That's my point. This storyline is very difficult because most of these baby boomers are still alive. I don't know if they're mostly still alive. But a lot of baby boomers are still alive, and they remember this. They look back, and let's say they supported Nixon in 68. After 75, What are they all going to say? Who they voted for in '68? I didn't vote for Nixon. Well, obviously you must have, because he not only won, but in 1972, he had the largest electoral landslide in history. Everybody voted for Nixon. No, I totally didn't trust the guy. Yeah, it's so much easier to say that 5, 10 years later. And now that you're 75, 80, who's your favorite poster boy of hating someone? Nixon. Well, you probably voted for him. This is weirdness. This is what happens when you have people that are still alive retelling history. Good news, I wasn't alive during any of this. So when I'm looking at this, I don't have any memories whatsoever. I think my first conscious memory was probably about politics, might have been in '79. I seem to remember sitting on the floor playing with my toys, watching Looney Tunes, and in the middle of Looney Tunes, Bugs Bunny, they had a news clip, and the news clip talked about something that Carter did. I had no idea who Carter was, except that I knew he was the president, but beyond that it didn't catch my brain. So we're talking like 78, maybe, 1978, long time later, 79. I don't remember any of this stuff. I don't think I was actually conscious of politics until probably 84, 85, 14, 15. I don't know how old you guys were when you were actually aware of the president and whether or not you liked him or didn't like him. And I can tell you, I may have been conscious when I was 14 or 15. Did I have any informed positions? No. I suspect I probably wasn't until I was ready to vote that I began to actually have informed positions. You guys talk to your friends. How many of your friends are right on the ball and know everything about politics? And how many of your friends say, I don't really think about that. I'm much more concerned about homework, my music, Facebook, whatever else. Okay? It's not uncommon, right? The point is that when I look at this, I'm not looking at it from memory. And yet, this group, they dominate. They wrote all your textbooks. And so their view, a little bit unique. To me, I think it's going to be fantastic in about 30 years. When you start writing about the 1960s, and the people that are writing have no idea what it was by memory. They only remember what the sources said. And it's going to be hard because you have to weed through 30 years of these books that were written by all the war protesters who decided to stay out of the war for so long that they got their doctorates and they wrote these books. So they have to wait till they all die, weed through them, and then you get somebody like Mary or someone here, and there, and you guys have no memory of the 60s, you don't even remember the 80s, you don't remember the 90s, right? So when you do the research, your research is from a completely different perspective. For me, I think that's great. We'll see. Maybe. Has to be 40 years. Let's see. I will be old. It's okay, I can handle that. Just like that. Okay, 2 minutes.